Hello and welcome to this edition of A Page from History. I am Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay. Bilateral visits are a very important aspect of international diplomacy. Most of them are routine, scheduled occasions that provide just a good photo opportunity. A few visits, however, are transformative in nature and become a watershed in the diplomatic history of two countries. The visit to India in 2000 by the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, was one such. He was the first American head of state to visit India in more than 20 years. This visit 15 years ago transformed Indo-US ties, taking it to a completely different level. President Clinton's visit to India 15 years ago was followed in a few months by a return visit to Washington by Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee to discuss how the year 2000 visit opened the doors to new possibilities and new areas of cooperation between India and the United States. I am joined by a very distinguished panel of experts. My first guest on this discussion is T.C.A. Rangachari, a former Indian Foreign Service officer who had been India's ambassador to China, to France, and held several other important positions. K.P. Vijayalakshmi, Professor of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and S. Venkat Narayan, a very senior journalist who has also been editor of several leading Indian papers as well as magazines. Let me begin with the professor amongst us, to try to give us a sense of history, as they say. Can we actually get some kind of assistance from you to contextualize the visit of President Clinton in the year 2000?
Well, yes, it was seen both as a strategic reorientation with the focus both on strategic affairs as well as an economic orientation.
Right.
Both these were seen as something that for the last 10 years, the end of the Cold War, it had taken them 10 years to actually come.
Yes.
But this had come, the visit had come after some very significant regional and global interests of India had been affected. For one, the global one was about the nuclear issue.
Right.
We had tested.
98 when we tested in Pokhran.
And that had really seen the relationship nosedive into areas hitherto not probed, perhaps. It had really sunk to
led to a kind of an international isolation of India.
It was a very bad time. And regionally, we had Kargil, which had also happened.
Right.
And that had been, in
Kashmir
some ways,
was also
Kashmir
simmering
was
at that time,
the
yes.
thing. So, there was a phrase used by the President of US at that time, the world's most dangerous place. And so things were not really what one would have thought after the end of the Cold War, with the primacy of economics and building a new world without a kind of, bipolar kind of blocks kind of thing. We had the opportunity to build a new world. And of course, the Americans called it the New World Order. But many countries in the South, global South, were looking at opportunities to rebuild and in fact explore new opportunities, and the Americans were still weighing the pros and cons. So the context was that we had already explored a sort of, I would say, serious but yet tentative defense relationship with the onset of Kicklighter proposals in 91 itself, which sort of roughly came to a head with the 1995 William Perry coming and signing the agreed minutes on defense cooperation. So to that extent, there was already something there.
But really, in terms of taking it to a political level, to engage at the highest levels,
absolutely,
to send a signal that we are willing to put the past behind, was actually the Clinton visit.
This Clinton visit itself was an interesting one because, as I said, they wanted to show that, we will not let the past hinder our future exploration.
And it happened just less than 2 years after the Pokhran blasts, which really
and in fact, the Pokhran blast, I think, opened the way for some reality check on both sides of what can be achieved.
Reality check is a good phrase that you have used. Let me get the sense of Venkat Narayan, as a senior journalist. We are also fortunate that he was there at the press conference when, Clinton actually addressed the media in Delhi after his meeting with Prime Minister Vajpayee. You were also on the trip when Prime Minister Narasimha Rao went to the United States in '93, another very landmark visit which kind of built up the case for what eventually became a fairly smooth and an exciting and interesting Indo-US relationship, completely at break with the past hostility of the '70s. What was the sense? Try to give us a sense of history. When you were there at the press conference, when they were talking about, building permanent institutional framework for dialogues at various levels, be it science and technology, be it energy issues, be it communications, just about anything and everything was kind of touched upon. Not all may have actually really kicked off in a big way within the Clinton years, but yes, it did lay the foundation for the way in which in the last 15 years Indo-US relations have evolved.
Yeah, I think the Clinton visit in the year 2000 was a landmark visit for the simple reason that soon after Pokhran II, we were in the international doghouse.
Right.
Sanctions are imposed by the United States and Japan, and it was a very tough time for India. And Clinton, before he came here, you had Kargil and the ouster of Nawaz Sharif by Pervez Musharraf in Pakistan, and during the Kargil thing to defuse the situation, Clinton personally got involved in it. And so then he came to India after 22 years, after
the first American president to come after such a long
Carter,
gap, after Jimmy Carter.
And it was one of the most publicized international events.
Right.
And he spent 5 days in India. He went to Agra, he went to Ranthambore, he saw the tigers, then he went to Bombay and spoke to the business community, he went to Hyderabad.
In fact, there was a great interest in the Indian media about his daughter also and his wife also.
That aroused the world's interest in India. And then after he went back, so many other heads of government who kept away from India since Pokhran II, they started coming back and all that. And if Indo-US relations have reached the present stage, Obama making 2 visits during his reign as the president, I think the Clinton visit laid the foundation
for a development like that, yes, an American president can think in terms of coming to India twice during his presidency. Let me get a sense from Mr. Rangachari. You were there in Delhi very much, getting a completely bird's eye view of what was happening. We have heard what Vijay Lakshmi and Venkat Narayan was saying. I would want you to contextualize it. Also, bring in the fact that President Clinton first arrived in Bangladesh. He turned out to be the first ever American president to visit Bangladesh, and then from India he went and did spend some time in Pakistan before going back home. Now, how does it look, in retrospect? How do you recall the importance of the visit?
Well, I suppose it's relevant to talk about the Clinton visit also because the Clinton family continues to remain relevant.
Right.
In Indo-US relations.
It was very relevant.
Hillary
in the
Clinton
last
came here as Secretary of State, and
there's
now
a possibility that they'll continue to be relevant in the years to come. Yes,
quite right. And if she does run for president, and if she does get the Democratic nomination, who knows? That continuity may still go on in future. But there is another aspect in the broader context, since you were talking about history and going back in years. I think one of the contradictions in Indo-US relations has been that while we had strategic divergence, we had bilateral convergence.
Right.
There is a great deal that India and the US did in the last 60+ years on a bilateral basis. In fact, I think today's generation doesn't remember.
Right.
But at that time, the largest check ever written in human history forgiving a debt by one nation to another was that by the United States when the PL 480 debts were forgiven.
Right.
And at that time, again, people don't remember or choose not to recall it, something like 66 paisa of the Indian rupee was owed to the United States. So the Indian economy at that time was in the hock, and 1974 when this check was written, it was the largest check in the Guinness Book of Records. That apart, at the global level, somehow we didn't seem to have a strategic convergence. So the Americans went one way, we went the other way, and too often the Americans suspected that we were in the Soviet camp, which we never were. But at the bilateral level, there were many things happened, including, most importantly for us, Green Revolution.
Right.
The Americans played an important part in that, and in various other ways.
I think in the Indian consciousness, quite often, we are talking about it, in the Indian consciousness, the decision of President Nixon, to send in the 7th Fleet during the 1971 war probably became very permanent in the Indian psyche. I'm talking about, purely giving you feedback as to what is, kind of a feedback we have got, as journalists traveling through the people and trying to understand as to why they were inherently anti-American. There's a very strong sentiment till about a decade and a half before, which was ranged against the Americans in India.
Well, that was the Cold War mentality.
Yes.
And if you recall, at that time, now that Kissinger, Nixon, everybody has published them, a great deal has been written, and under the Freedom of Information Act, a lot of the documents are available. The fact is that the Americans during 1971 wanted to prove to China that they were a reliable ally.
Right.
And in order to prove that, they wanted to show that they won't let down another ally.
Right.
And therefore they took that, the quote-unquote tilt, which became the hallmark of the Nixon administration as far as India was concerned. And funnily enough, in 1974, Kissinger himself has written, he had written at that time, just on the eve of his visit, that however much India may move one way or another, it will never become a Cuba or any of the East European countries, that India will always maintain its independence. So at one level, the Americans always recognized that India would have an independent foreign policy, but they were not, because they could not accommodate us in their own global strategic calculations. There was this feeling that India was on the other side, or at least it was not on our side. Now, I think today what is happening is that there is a convergence, both at the global strategic level and at the level of bilateral cooperation. So you have, George Bush telling India that we are going to make you a superpower, and Obama and India agreeing on, for example, South China Seas in the vision document, and various other things. So therefore this convergence...
You have actually talked about this very important aspect. We'll talk about it also, what is happening between India and US in the current context a bit later in the program. It's time for me to take a little break. I'll come back and resume this conversation. In May 1998, barely 3 months after becoming Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee authorized nuclear testing at Pokhran. It resulted, as we were talking about, in India's global isolation. Indo-US ties were in any case historically very lukewarm. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, global relations were reworked. Between India and the US, this was not attempted before the Clinton visit in a big way. Be with us, this program will continue. Welcome back to a page from history. We are taking stock of Indo-US relations 15 years after the watershed visit to India by President Bill Clinton. Venkat Narayan, to try to get a sense from you, in the previous segment we were talking about the inherent, feeling of animosity or, angst towards the Americans, which was there deeply entrenched in Indian psyche. But by 1998 onwards, when there was a transition within the politics in India, you had the NDA forming the government in 1998, the BJP forming and deciding to go in for a nuclear test. By 2000, when President Clinton comes, do you think that Indian political situation had started changing, the mood of the people had started changing, that it was time to re-engage with the United States?
Yeah, I think so. You see, the Americans have a problem. If you are not their friend, you must be their enemy.
But isn't that universal?
No, but India was once Mrs. Gandhi was asked when during one of her famous trips to the US when Johnson was the president, she said, "Madam, are you pro-American or pro-Russian?" She said, "I'm neither pro-American nor pro-Russian. I'm pro-Indian." I think it took a bit of time for the Americans to realize, and after the collapse of the Russian Empire helped a great deal, of course. And Narasimha Rao made 2 trips to the US, soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union and during his time. And I think there was a realization that you cannot keep India as one American ambassador told me, India is too big a country to be anybody's chamcha.
Right.
You know,
they would not have used the word chamcha though.
No, but this fellow was learning Hindi.
Maybe he would have.
He was learning Hindi. He said, you know, we know that you are too big a country to be anybody's chamcha.
Right.
He used the word. So they realized, and you see, being democracies, there is a lot more of you know, commonalities between the two countries.
Right.
And look at the trade, for example. It was barely $5 billion 25 years ago. Now we are reaching 100 billion, and it is going to be $500 billion in the next 5 to 10 years.
Right.
At any given point of time, you find 100,000 Indian students studying in the universities in America.
Right.
You now have more than 35 lakhs of Indians spread across the United States, and it is possibly the highest earning minority community in the United States, which earns twice the wages of an average American. Okay? So no American president can afford to fight the election.
But they also have elected leaders who are Americans of Indian origin.
Absolutely.
Who want to play down their Indian origins.
And see what is happening with Jindal.
Yes.
He is in serious trouble because he tried to do that. So there is no question that
it's very difficult to actually disconnect with the diaspora.
Yeah.
Vijay Lakshmi, you know, whenever we talk about you know, some point which Venkat Narayan indicated, you know, the shared values. In fact, if you go and look at the papers and the joint statements and the declarations, even President Clinton's press conference, you know, there was a lot of emphasis on shared values, commonalities, common purposes, common goals. Now, where does it, you know, we all say that democracy is what unites us, you know, we are the largest democracy in the world, United States naturally should engage with us, because our region has been full traditionally of countries which are not democratic or truly democratic as they should have been. You know, but beyond this cosmetic link of being democracies, what all is there really that can be the basic foundations of you know, a very healthy and vibrant relationship between two such large countries?
I can start by saying that there will be a strategic relevance. Shared strategic future comes out of strategic relevance to each other. And that encompasses both security and economics and social cohesion, you know, all of it, comprehensive national power and national interest.
Right.
So this, you know, for a long time, you've heard several historians, I think, have started saying, I mean, historians of Indo-US relations, use this phrase, strategic irrelevance. India was strategically irrelevant to the United States. But at the time of Clinton visit, 10 years after the end of the Cold War, also saw a huge dramatic change in the Indian economy. And that 5 to 6% growth.
Also 10 years of Indian, you know, liberalization.
Economic reforms. And it starts actually, according to my analysis, in the 80s.
Right.
You know, 80s was when we really began to look at liberalization in a far more serious way.
Right.
And I have some, you know, interest in looking at that period to see what it led to. But by the time the Americans began to seriously consider the economic potential that this relationship can have, it was already facing or seeing a 5 to 6% growth. That was a very good one. And suddenly there were bidding wars for India. The second major strategic change, I mean, the second major contributor to this change was the IT industry of India. And that, you know, was directly part of the you know, the MOUs that we tried to sign in the 80s, mid-80s. So my point is, even during the Cold War, there were some brief moments where we were actually doing a lot of things bilaterally to help each other and to help India. So these things didn't really become the way we see now NSSP and nuclear deal that we got under President Bush. But the reality was this economic potential. And I think the growing economic importance of India was beginning to be recognized as one very major reason for this transformation or reorientation of the United States. The second was the South Asian rubric, you know, organizing South Asia for a strategic stability that Bush talks about later on. Indo-US statements reflect on two reasons, two important strategic statements from Mr. Bush's time, and that is, you know, looking for strategic stability in Asia, not South Asia, but also looking for India as a global power, you know, a major power in 21st century. So for that, you see the seeds in Clinton's visit, because that, you know, you mentioned that Bangladesh visit. The oil and natural gas fields from Bangladesh, all of that, and then coming, and still, you know, we had, but my point is economic as well as the South Asian regions.
You know, basically two
No, I just
points.
want to say one more point, Nilanjan, and that is there were still problems though, because though there was the CTBT was let off, the FMCT was a negotiation, etc., we still had differences on a number of issues that needed more time than what Mr. Clinton, because that was almost at the end of his
It was virtually, you know, only 2 years left. You know.
It was in a way very, very fortunate that President Bush by himself was very interested in India and continued, and not only continued but expanded the breadth of the issues, and I mean breadth of the relationship to, and took it to new heights. So that was really the you know, they made a window of opportunity, but it became a door under President Bush.
You know, Mr. Rangachari, what Vijay Lakshmi is basically saying, you know, that the basically 2 issues on 2 points on which possibly led to the American decision to really look at India very seriously and re-engage with it. One was India's growing economic might, and the other was the strategic locations, also the potential of it being a fairly you know, powerful and a strategic ally. You know, do you think that those were the real reasons as to why the Americans were basically beginning to rework their relationships in South Asia?
Well, I think if you look back now about 15 years, you know, just 98 we talked about the nuclear tests. But 1999 was the Balkans War. And if you remember, that is the time when the Chinese embassy in Belgrade got bombed. The Chinese thought it was deliberate, the Americans said it was by mistake. And immediately following on that, there was very large-scale demonstrations outside the US embassy, including stone throwing and you know, people getting hurt, etc., which is the first time since the Cultural Revolution when that happened in Peking. Now, that is the kind of global setting that was developing. Russia at that point had become somewhat irrelevant in the
it was
American
going through, its economy was in shambles.
Exactly. And you know, twice
internal politics was also terribly turbulent.
That's right. So China was a new emerging power, and while the American investment in China was growing, there were doubts in regard to the strategic implications of China's growth. That's also the time when you hear...
It's also the time of major transition taking place both in politics and in economy of China.
Quite right. So when you look at that, the strategic importance or relevance of India becomes a little more clear. But insofar as the economy is concerned, I think back then the weight that India carried in the global economy was not very significant.
There was a huge potential. That's what I was actually looking at.
That is what we were working at.
And still, I think people hoped that
it is the potential that we were working on. Even today, you know, I give you one very interesting statistic during the Lok Sabha budget debates. Our railway minister mentioned that government plans to spend 8.5 lakh crore rupees over the next 5 years. I had a very rough calculation. This works out to about $140 billion over 5 years. The Chinese are proposing to spend $140 billion on their railways just this year alone. Now, that's the kind of distance.
So we got to generate that kind of resource.
So we need to make, the potential has to be converted into a reality. And that means that there has to be a great deal of hard work. And I think what we need to realize on the Indian side is that today United States amongst the developed countries is the only country which has not just recovering, also recovered. And it's much, you know, stronger than any of the other developed economies. United States, you know, you were just mentioning about the large number of in the Indian community there. But for us, United States is a source of capital, it is a source, it's a market, and also a source of technology. Now, therefore, it is in our interest to have as close a partnership as we possibly can to, for want of a better word, let me use, exploit the advantages that the United States has insofar as we are concerned. Separately, if it is possible for India and the United States to come to the conclusion that there are convergence convergences insofar as global strategic interests are concerned, very good. That would be a bonus.
Okay.
But purely in terms of our selfish developmental interest, which is the focus of this government, it makes a great deal of sense for India to work very closely with the United States.
I think that's well put. It's time for me to take another break. I'll come back and resume this conversation. The unresolved Kashmir issue was very much on top of President Clinton's agenda. In the middle of the visit, terrorists attack a Sikh group in the village of Chittisinghpura in Jammu. The terrorist strike cast a shadow on the visit. Stay with us, this program will continue. Welcome back to a page from history. 15 years ago, US President Bill Clinton became the first American head of state to visit India in 2 decades. Vijayalakshmi, can I bring in the entire issue of Kashmir? Kashmir had been through a boil throughout the 90s, starting from 1989, the time when Rubaiyat Saeed was kidnapped, to the state being placed under president's rule for a long period of 6 years. Eventually elections were held in mid-90s. You had a national conference-led government. But yes, there were these regular terrorist strikes going on. India would keep on repeatedly mentioning that there was a problem of cross-border terrorism, but we had very few nations endorsing at the international level what India was saying. It was basically being said that this is your problem, it is not part of the world. It only becomes a problem of the world. Terrorism becomes a part of the world only when it goes and strikes on 9/11 in the United States of America. But during the Clinton visit, you had the massacre in Chittisinghpura, an attack which was painted in the world as something which was stage managed. In fact, if one actually goes and looks at the Indian official record, that was the allegation that was made by Indian intelligence agencies. Was it deliberately brought in, that the entire issue, in a way to cloud the thinking of President Clinton, who was very clear that India and Pakistan essentially have a bilateral problem, they have to resolve it bilaterally, and he declared at the end of the visit that the United States is not going to get involved in negotiations as a third party in what was essentially a two-nation dispute.
Yeah, lots of questions
lots
in that.
Lots of questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me start by...
Basically the thing is that Kashmir, in a nutshell, do you think that President Clinton paved the way for a better appreciation of India's position on Kashmir?
Yes, he did, because the number one problem we have always had, and I used to appear on those television shows in the 90s, and I must say that, we used to discuss whether we need a facilitator or a mediator, you know, and very frankly, Indian position was, I don't know about intelligence agencies and the media coverage at that time of blaming each other. That's a constant kind of a different sort of a fabric. But the government position was that we do not need mediation. And after Kargil, Clinton administration's insistence that Pakistan now better negotiate directly is actually what we wanted. It was in
adhere
effect
to the composite dialogue process agreed between India and Pakistan.
He said that we are looking for stability. Our problem by then was not so much how the Americans and we would agree on Pakistan, because we found a route to talk. But what I think really started by the time was about China. George Fernandez and, so many things about the letter that was leaked, etc. So China and, US relations, will they privilege their economic interdependent great relationship with China over India, US, expectedly timid at this point, but burgeoning, possibly greater than China kind of relationship? That was our doubt. But the main change about Kashmir issue was that US had actually shifted about its understanding of Islamic fundamentalists, whom they had trained and armed, you see, and to go into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. And this change came about because of both Osama bin Laden's rise and the USS...
2000 had not yet become such a big threat to
No, but there was already in US Cole, is it? Or was it US... I don't remember the
USS Cole.
USS Cole, the sinking of USS Cole, the terrorist strikes that kept happening during Clinton's time. By the time, the National Security Strategy of 2002 actually makes a lot of mention of this. But you see the last national security documents of the Clinton time, you will find that Islamic fundamentalists are now seen as a major threat to the United States. And China was beginning to share a bit of that. That, I think, also helped in terms of while they were not yet ready to use cross-border terrorism as a word with the official documents.
Let me bring in Ambassador Rangachari on this particular issue. You know that when she talks about that by 2000, when President Clinton comes to India, the United States is beginning to see as a rise of the fundamentalist section within the Islamic community as a major threat to itself, and sees synergy with other nations which are also gripped or facing the threat from similar quarters. Do you think that this is the way it actually boiled down to? If one actually tries to say that this is possibly the first time when actually the entire argument that Samuel Huntington, the social scientist, talked about, that post-Cold War, it's all in the
clash of civilizations,
which is going to dominate confrontation and conflicts in the world. Do you think that is what was actually the first time they were seeing it happening in practice?
Actually, let us step back a bit. I think we must separate the issue of Jammu and Kashmir and the issue of terrorism, because it's true that insofar as Jammu and Kashmir is concerned, finally bilateralism as the way forward, dialogue between India and Pakistan, that came to be by and large accepted by everybody.
Right.
Still not by Pakistan though, because it still counts upon intervention by the international community.
Yes.
But let's leave that aside for a moment. As far as terrorism is concerned, even today there is a distinction drawn between terrorism as it affects, let's say, the West, and terrorism as it affects other countries, including India.
Right.
We have had huge difficulties in trying to get various entities in Pakistan which are targeting India listed and named for sanctions by the United States and by the other Western countries. That problem has still not completely disappeared.
It has eased slightly.
It has eased somewhat, but let's not forget, just a few years ago, 2008, when Mumbai happened, there are a lot of complaints on the Indian side that the United States had intelligence which it did not share with India, which might have prevented that incident in which also American lives were lost.
Right.
Now, therefore, while there has been progress, we are still not on the same page insofar as counter-terrorism is concerned in its entirety. Even today, when it comes to organizations which are only targeting India, we have difficulty in persuading the United States, persuading the countries of the West for different reasons. They would rather that they go up to a point and not beyond. Look at even the definition that is made of the Taliban, that they are not a terrorist group, they are militants. That's not how we would
like to look at it.
Because
and also the distinction between so-called good Taliban and the bad Taliban.
Quite right. Now,
the good terrorist and a bad terrorist.
The reason why we would not like to look upon the Taliban in that light is because of their ideological persuasions.
Right.
The mentality that took Afghanistan back several decades. During those 7 or 8 years when they were in power in Afghanistan. Now, if you look again, since we are talking in terms of history, through the Cold War, the West never made a distinction, in terms of, yes, okay, Andropov you can do business with, somebody else you could do business with, Gorbachev you could do business with, but the basic goal of eliminating communism, that was never lost.
Right.
Now, in this case, the goal is not eliminating the Taliban, although that is what it started with when the war on terror began, to get rid of entire fundamentalism and so on.
It's no longer
terrorism.
I think the reason is because now they're making the distinction, because the current negotiations, even the Afghan president who's visiting the US at this point, he is already talking to the Pakistanis on building a reconciliation through a reconciliation process, bringing the Taliban in. So this is something now
which is potentially dangerous for India.
But the distinction of Osama bin Laden being given sanctuary by Taliban brought the focus of US directly onto Taliban at that time. But later on, as things evolved, I think they made this distinction.
As the threat to the United States from Afghanistan
because
recedes,
it
is not really going to be.
No, but let me quickly make one point here insofar as the Afghan position is concerned. What the Afghans are saying when they talk in terms of reconciliation, etc., is that any group which accepts reconciliation should accept the Afghan constitution and function under it. They are not talking in terms of accepting the Taliban as the Taliban was and
but
is
a
in
modified
the terms that we go back several years. Now, if once you accept, that's also the kind of thing we say to our own groups in India, you accept the constitution, you function within the constitution,
we are willing to talk to you, provided you want to stay within the framework of the constitution.
Of the Indian Union, Indian constitution and so on.
Nilanjan, main point is the Taliban regime started giving sanctuary to Osama at the Clinton time, and that became an issue. And later on, when Hillary Clinton was giving speeches as the Secretary of State, she mentions only Al-Qaeda as a major threat under Obama, because the Afghan
war. Any longer mention Taliban.
But now Taliban is also, there is a Pakistani Taliban, there is also this. So I think now we are converging. It's been a long 15 years, but there is some movement, I think, from India's point of view also, that we would like to see this Taliban, which accepts an Afghan constitution, to come into the process.
No, let me go back with Venkat Narayan back to that visit 15 years ago, to the press conference of Clinton. Let's also talk in terms of the news point which came out. At the end of it, the journalist comes out with a headline point. From that, I can see Ambassador Rangachari grinning when I say the headline point.
I'm agreeing with you.
Yes. But that is what is ultimately the basic search of at least two people here. One is and now when we talk about the headline point, and when we say that the headline point which we found at that point, which is relevance, which was very important at that point, still has great relevance today. What is the link that you find?
You see, I think the Clinton visit 15 years ago made two specific points. He was here for 5 days, and he went to Islamabad and spent barely 5 hours.
Very few hours.
And he made a television broadcast, in which he asked Pervez Musharraf to restore democracy. He said, you cannot redraw borders with military force. He said, the US is not going to interfere in the resolution of the Kashmir dispute, and this is primarily a bilateral thing. This is what we have been saying.
It was one of the most disappointing visits for Pakistan as far as the US any visit was concerned.
Absolutely, they were so disappointed, and so earlier the Pakistanis were thinking that the Americans were backing their side for a variety of reasons, but the Clinton visit made it very clear, hello, you cannot use military to redraw the border in Kashmir. And what happened in Kargil, and Clinton's personal intervention, and ringing up Nawaz Sharif and telling him, listen, get your fellows out of the Indian territory and so on. So that clearly brought the Kashmir issue in the global arena, in the sense that, okay, it is the Pakistanis who are making trouble. So that was very, very important from our point of view.
So would you say that it got internationalized? Yes. But from the way India wanted it to get internationalized.
Yes.
And that was possibly one of the major diplomatic victories as far as India was concerned.
Absolutely.
That is what was the main takeaway.
It sort of led towards the final joint statement, which was, both important because of the dream-like quality. They said we dream of a strategic partnership, and of course today we talk of one. And the very elaborate institutional framework they laid out within the two leaders. There was already so much of work, I think, that went into this visit, simply because right from Narasimha Rao's time, there has been a lot of behind-the-scenes work. So while you talk of headlines, behind the headlines remained this institutional plodding and plotting, so that we could actually discuss both convergences and divergences and move towards a strategic partnership, because I'm looking at the documents 15 years down the line. It seems eerie, but and Richard Haas was that time, not yet in, of course, he was not in the government at that time, but next time he did become in under Bush something. But Haas wrote a piece, and he said, I wonder if India and the US can actually talk about China. Can we have an approach towards China? So that factor was coming up nicely.
I'll take another break at this point and come back and resume this conversation. At the end of his visit, President Clinton said, and I quote here, I have come to India because I want to build a dynamic and lasting partnership based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. The question 15 years later is, to what extent was this done? Don't go away. We will pose this simple question to our experts after a short break. Welcome back to a page from history. It is a decade and a half since US President Bill Clinton visited India. It remains a defining trip in the context of Indo-US relations. Ambassador Rangachari, we are talking about what President Clinton said before he left India. He made one of the statements saying the build-up lasting and a long-term relationship. In the last 15 years, where has India-US, Indo-US relations moved? How have ties changed in these last decade and a half? Just about 2 months ago, President Obama was here, wound up a fairly successful visit by all accounts.
I think we will have to, if you're going to make a report card, it will probably be a mixed report card. I think there's some issues.
That is the way it should be in democracies in any case.
Not necessarily, but if it is a mixed card, we have to see which side it is mixed more on.
Okay.
Well, we have made a very, very major stride with the nuclear deal, which has now made it possible for India to get into the mainstream of civilian nuclear
use of nuclear power,
cooperation with the international community, which means that we can existing plants will be able to get the fuel for running, plus new power generating plants can come up. Although again, to put it in context, if you look at the NPCIL figures, last year the total generation was around 5,000 megawatts. Out of the total of 264 gigawatts that India produced by the electricity.
Still minuscule.
And if you take the present government's target of 100 gigawatts by 2022 of solar energy alone, that's virtually 50% of what we are producing, then clearly the nuclear energy, because it's going to take a long time to set up plants, there are all kinds of fears, anxieties, etc.
Safety issues.
It may take, safety issues. It might take, it might not play that big a role. But the more important thing is purely in terms of the way it has played out on the international stage. The nuclear deal is extremely
I think it's psychologically also very important given the kind of breakthrough that has happened in the last several years. It is something we started almost had gone on for about a decade. So it has been a major psychological breakthrough that yes, India can get assistance on civil nuclear issues.
And the other thing which has happened is, well, two things. One, that India has also in the course of the last few years been brought into a kind of a global management in the framework of G20. The Americans now acknowledge that it is not possible for the US alone or the G8 to manage the global economy. It's necessary to bring in the emerging economies, etc. And the other aspect is the transformation of the vocabulary to Indo-Pacific. So we are not only talking in terms of Asia, we're not talking in terms of US and India or US and Asia, we're talking in terms of a Indo-Pacific partnership. So on a very broad scale, if you look at the broad canvas, these are very big signatures, so to speak, of Indo-US, growing Indo-US partnership.
Vijayalakshmi, as an academic, how do you look at this? What Ambassador Rangachari was saying, that this broadening of the entire jargon, if I can use it, Indo-Pacific, going beyond Indo-US. We're no longer just talking in terms of I and you, but we're talking about we and them, a huge community that we're talking about.
This is a very significant development, I would agree. In particular, I would draw your attention to 2 or 3 steps which started. In 2002, the National Security Strategy mentions India and Indian Ocean and freedom of the seas and America's interest in one breath. So it started right then. And then it has moved to actually now with the joint statement mentioning South China Sea and the behavior of all nations to contribute to the stability and peace and not take on any kind of military or other forceful decisions. Now, Indo-Pacific as a concept began in 2007 and then continuously has been upgraded to now I think we have a Center for Indo-Pacific Studies. So I think if you see the kind of logic, what is the logic of this Indo-Pacific is to not just mix the 2 oceans, but to really talk about both commercial and shipping worlds and the strategic world together. Because not only is this Indian Ocean region really, the sea lane and the safety and freedom of navigation of the seas, that's the real principle on which we began to talk. But I think more importantly what we're seeing is that the domain consciousness is so serious now in both countries that we actually saw a part of it reflected in our joint statement under with Mr. Modi and Mr. Obama, right? And the reasons are many, but the fact sheet on IOR will tell you about both its natural minerals, it's an oil conduit, choke points, etc., strategic choke points, etc. The main problem is also because it is also the area where piracies take place. This is also a labor movement kind of, people move from this country to the other country. It also has number of problematic states. West calls it failing states, but there are also problematic states. All of this is bringing us in some ways to think innovatively, both on trilateral or quadrilaterals, in which China could be included, because there is no, both countries are at great pains to assure you that China is not the target of these maneuvers. But yet at the same time, this is sought to be a kind of Asian, or even more than that, a security and economic architecture in which countries should participate on international lines which are already existing, and no revisionist power should take a chance and start, what it means. So this kind of thing is going on, but I think the formalization by our joint statement is clearly an indication that we've come from 2002. 2000 we begin, 2002
we begin to kickstart the entire process.
And then you see this in 2007 and 2010. Hillary Clinton comes to Chennai in 12, and she also says that in look east and act east, all of that.
Visit in 2005 when the entire intent over Indo-US nuclear deal gets set up in.
Yeah, exactly. But on Indo-Pacific, you can look at 2007, then the QDRs of the various years, if you look. The reorientation of US maritime strategy starts from 2007 officially, and then Indian Ocean becomes a real focus. But will there be commitment? But my larger issue is, and I want to just flag this, an emerging power and a super global power. Would we always have same interests? And how do we deal with this? I mean, in medium, long term,
we have to look
the
at the short term,
will
medium,
not,
as well as the long term, all the three terms.
Yeah, and therefore hegemon and emerging power. Will it actually
I was given the context of the World Cup, I was tempted to say that it is like, an opening batsman batting with number 11. The number 11's interest is to take a quick single and allow the opening batsman to take the strike.
Yeah. So something like that.
That's well put,
it's an interesting kind of time, but I think we are showing deep signs of maturity. I think we have declared a hand in a game of world poker, perhaps, and our cards, some of our cards are on the table.
We are speaking a lot of similes and metaphors, let me check with Venkat Narayan. In about 2 months from now, this present Indian government would complete 1 year in office. When Mr. Modi became Prime Minister, there were a lot of apprehensions regarding the direction Indo-US relations would take because of certain events in the past, which have clearly been put behind. Now, when we actually take stock of it, that they have been put behind in the past, they no longer linger, they no longer have the shadow of the past is not there on the present. How much of the real impact do you find and the continuity from what was kick-started in 2000 in today's relationship which is there with the United States? 15 years down the line, how much of relevance is the Clinton visit and then the subsequent Vajpayee visit to Washington, which was a defining year as far as 2000 was concerned in Indo-US relations?
It's not just 15 years down the line, even 150 years down the line, I would say that the Clinton visit was very, very crucial at that particular point of time. After Vivekananda's visit to the US in 1893 and Mark Twain's visit to India, if you put it like that, and the fight between Roosevelt and Churchill,
from a watershed moment, you're making it an epochal event.
Yeah, but I want to say one thing. I think the Chinese are already getting worried about India and the United States getting together, ganging up against that. I think that should not be the case. After all, till the 17th century, India and China accounted for 2/3 of the global trade. For the first 1,000 years, from 180 to 1000 AD, India was the world's largest economy. So we are now $2 trillion. Globally, barely 1% of the trade we account for. But if the growth is maintained, they're talking about double-digit growth. 10 years down the line, we have already overtaken Japan in terms of PPP. So China, United States, India are going to the three most important countries in the world by the year 2025. And they should not be fighting with each other, but they should be working together and provide leadership to the global community.
Right. Ambassador Rangachari, you are undoubtedly the best expert on China as far as all four of us are concerned here. What Venkat Narayan is saying, that China should not really get worried. Do you think that China should really get worried about the state of Indo-US relations at the moment?
Well, the Chinese, I think, do tend to project that impression. In fact, at the beginning of the visit of President Obama,
right,
there were some articles that appeared in the Chinese press showing that kind of alarm, at the same time being very disdainful. And finally they came to the conclusion that no, India has always followed an independent policy, therefore the relationship with the United States and relationship with China will not be in any way hurtful insofar as Chinese interests are concerned, and India will not play this containment game, etc. I don't think we need to worry too much on that score, because we need to be clear in our own minds that we have in the past and will continue to follow an independent policy. Since we are talking history, I think we should go back to our independence.
Right.
Nehru used to talk at one time, immediately post-independence, of having, being an ally with the United States, basically because of the value systems. And then, of course, several different things happened, including the fact that India's approach, given India's vast poverty, was very different from a capitalist United States, which had followed a different path of economic development and so on.
We had different priorities.
We had different priorities. Very well put. Yes, exactly. Now, I think increasing for several reasons which we have talked about, whether it is the diaspora, whether it is the global situation, whether it is need for
many more shared commons, as
quite right, and also of having to manage a global system with everybody's cooperation. Indo-US relations are today at a stage where I think if the two work together, it will be good not just for India and US, but for the international community as a whole.
For the entire world. I think on this note, it's really perfect to wind up this discussion. Thank you for coming and joining me on this very important discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
When Prime Minister Vajpayee addressed the joint session of the United States Congress in 2000, he said that the two nations had decided to step away from the past. While areas of disagreement remain, but there are more nuanced and there is greater understanding in the US of India's position on its main concerns. The Clinton visit in the year 2000 and Vajpayee's return visit later that year gave a decisive push to bilateral relations. Do write to us at historylstv@gmail.com. We shall be back next week with another page from history and another panel of experts. Till then, goodbye.